Imagine walking past someone every single day, seeing them empty trash cans and mop floors, never giving them a second thought. That's exactly what happened at Peterson Air Force Base in Colorado Springs. For 3 years, base personnel watched an elderly woman quietly go about her janitorial duties, invisible, unremarkable, just another face in the crowd. But sometimes, the most extraordinary heroes hide in plain sight. And sometimes, it takes just one moment, one glimpse of a worn leather flight jacket hanging in a locker, to reveal a secret that changes everything. What they discovered about this humble janitor would shake the entire base to its core and remind everyone that courage doesn't always wear a uniform. At least not anymore. Every morning at 5:30 a.m., while most of Colorado Springs still slept under the shadow of Pikes Peak, Margaret Chen pulled her beat-up Honda Civic into the employee parking lot of Peterson Air Force Base. At 67, her movements were deliberate but steady as she gathered her cleaning supplies from the trunk. The same ritual she'd performed for 3 years running. To the hundreds of airmen, officers, and personnel who passed her daily, she was simply Maggie the janitor. A small, quiet woman with graying hair, pulled back in a practical bun, wearing the standard-issue blue uniform of the base maintenance crew. The security guard at the employee entrance barely looked up as she swiped her badge. "Morning, Maggie," he'd mumble, already turning his attention back to his coffee and morning briefings. She'd nod politely, understanding that to him, to most everyone here, she was part of the background, as unremarkable as the cleaning cart she pushed down the pristine hallways. But Margaret Chen had learned long ago that sometimes invisibility was a kind of protection, a way to carry secrets that were too heavy, too complicated for casual conversation. Her route never varied. First, the administrative offices where colonels and majors shuffled papers and made decisions that affected operations across 3 continents. She'd empty their wastebaskets filled with classified document shreds, dust their commendation displays, and polish the plaques that spoke of courage, honor, and service above self. The irony wasn't lost on her, though she kept such thoughts to herself. Next came the briefing rooms where young pilots gathered for mission planning, their flight suits crisp and their confidence bright as Colorado sunshine. She'd watch them sometimes, these eager aviators with their technical discussions about aircraft specifications and flight patterns, and something deep in her chest would tighten, a mixture of pride and loss that she'd grown expert at suppressing. The hardest part of her day was always the pilot ready room. Here the walls were lined with photographs of aircraft, sleek fighters, massive transports, reconnaissance planes that pushed the boundaries of engineering and human endurance. The pilots would joke and laugh as she worked around them, planning weekend leave or discussing their latest training exercises. They were good people, she'd learned over the years, dedicated and professional. But when they looked at her, if they looked at all, they saw only what she allowed them to see. A grandmother-aged woman who knew how to make windows sparkle and floors shine. They couldn't see the young woman who had once worn a flight suit of her own, whose hands had gripped the controls of aircraft far more dangerous than anything these peacetime pilots would ever encounter. Margaret had mastered the art of being present, but not noticed. She'd perfected the timing of when to clean which areas, how to work efficiently around important meetings, when to make herself scarce during classified briefings. The base ran on schedules and protocols, and she'd learned them all, not from any manual or orientation, but from 3 years of careful observation. She knew which officers drank their coffee black and which ones needed 3 sugars. She knew who worked late into the evening and who arrived before dawn. She knew the rhythms of military life because they echoed rhythms she'd once lived herself, in another uniform, in another country, in what felt like another lifetime. But knowledge and recognition were different things entirely. The base personnel saw her efficiency, her quiet professionalism, her perfect attendance record. What they didn't see were the moments when she'd pause in front of a particular aircraft photograph, her cleaning cloth forgotten in her hand as memories threatened to surface. They didn't notice how her posture straightened almost imperceptibly when the national anthem played during retreat ceremony, or how her eyes would track the contrails of departing aircraft long after they'd disappeared into the vast Colorado sky. These were the small tells of a life lived before, of service rendered in ways these young warriors couldn't imagine. As she finished her morning rounds and prepared for the afternoon shift change, Margaret allowed herself one small ritual. In the women's locker room, tucked away in the farthest corner where the civilian maintenance staff kept their personal belongings, sat her own metal locker. Standard issue, unremarkable, secured with a simple combination lock that she'd memorized years ago. Inside, beneath her spare uniform and personal items, hung a piece of leather that told a story she'd never shared with anyone at Peterson Air Force Base. A story that would have changed everything, if anyone had bothered to look. Tuesday started like any other day, but Peterson Air Force Base had learned that routine could shatter in an instant. Margaret was midway through her afternoon cleaning schedule when the emergency maintenance alarm echoed through the administration building. A water pipe had burst in the women's locker room, not unusual for a facility built in the 1960s, but always inconvenient. Within minutes, maintenance crews were scrambling to shut off water valves while Margaret grabbed her industrial wet vacuum and headed toward what she knew would be several hours of cleanup work. The locker room was a disaster. 2 inches of water covered the concrete floor, seeping under locker doors and soaking into anything left on the bottom shelves. Staff Sergeant Lisa Rodriguez, one of the few female pilots on base, stood surveying the damage to her gear with the kind of controlled frustration that Margaret had seen countless times in military personnel facing unexpected setbacks. 3 years of flight logs, Rodriguez muttered, pulling soggy paperwork from her flooded locker. My promotion packet was in there. Let me help, Margaret said quietly, already positioning her vacuum to start extracting water. She'd learned that offering assistance without being asked was usually welcomed during crises. People in uniform appreciated initiative, even from the cleaning staff. Together they began moving personal items to higher, drier locations while the maintenance crew worked on the plumbing repairs. Airman First Class Jennifer Walsh had just returned from a training flight, her flight suit still bearing the creases from her ejection seat harness. She was in a hurry to change and get to her next briefing, juggling her helmet bag and flight gear while trying to assess the water damage to her locker. That's when it happened. The moment that would change everything for Margaret Chen. Walsh, distracted by the chaos and rushing to salvage her belongings, backed into Margaret's corner locker with enough force to pop the simple combination lock that had kept Margaret's secrets safe for 3 years. The metal door swung open with a creak that seemed disproportionately loud in the humid, echoing space. Margaret turned from her cleaning just in time to see her carefully guarded privacy spilling out onto the wet floor. Her spare uniform, her personal items, and hanging prominently in the center, a piece of clothing that had no business being in a janitor's locker. A vintage leather flight jacket well worn but meticulously maintained bearing patches and insignia that made Rodriguez stop mid-sentence. Oh God, I'm so sorry, Walsh stammered, immediately moving to help gather Margaret's scattered belongings. But her hands froze as she reached for the leather jacket. The patches were unmistakable to anyone with military training: squadron insignia, mission markers, and most prominently, the distinctive blue and red roundel of the Republic of China Air Force. These weren't replicas or commemorative items. The wear patterns, the fading, the careful repairs all spoke of genuine service, real missions, actual combat operations. Rodriguez moved closer, her pilot's eye immediately cataloging details that would be meaningless to civilians but spoke volumes to those in the aviation community. "Ma'am," she said carefully, using a tone of respect that she'd never employed with Margaret before. "This is a real flight jacket. These patches, these are from active duty squadrons." Her voice carried a mixture of confusion and growing realization that the woman she'd walked past hundreds of times might not be who she appeared to be. Margaret's hands trembled slightly as she reached for her jacket, but Rodriguez gently intercepted her. "Please," the sergeant said, "I don't mean to pry, but these mission patches, some of these operations were classified at levels that required serious security clearances. How did you—" She trailed off, unable to complete a question that seemed to challenge everything she thought she knew about the quiet janitor who'd been invisible for so long. The moment stretched between them, heavy with implications none of them fully understood yet. Walsh looked between Margaret and Rodriguez, sensing the significance but not grasping its full meaning. Other personnel had begun to notice the commotion, drawn by the unusual sight of uniformed military members treating the cleaning lady with sudden, intense attention. Margaret stood perfectly still, her decades of practiced invisibility shattered by a simple accident that had revealed the one thing she'd never intended anyone at Peterson to discover. "Those patches," Rodriguez continued, her voice softer now. "They're not just any patches. Some of these missions, they were dangerous. Really dangerous." She looked directly at Margaret, and for the first time in 3 years, truly saw her, not as part of the scenery, but as someone whose story was clearly far more complex than anyone had imagined. The question hung in the air, unasked but understood by everyone present. Who was Margaret Chen really? And how had a janitor come to possess the flight jacket of what appeared to be a decorated combat pilot? Word traveled fast on a military base, especially when it involved something as intriguing as a janitor with a combat pilot's flight jacket. Within an hour, Senior Master Sergeant Mike Thompson from base operations had joined Rodriguez and Walsh in the now drying locker room, drawn by reports that seemed too unusual to ignore. Thompson had 22 years of Air Force experience and could read military insignia like other people read newspapers. What he saw hanging from Margaret's locker made him question everything he thought he understood about military protocol and security. "Ma'am, I need to ask you some questions," Thompson said, his tone professional but not unkind. Margaret sat quietly on one of the wooden benches, her hands folded in her lap with the same patience she'd shown during countless security briefings over the years. The jacket lay spread across the bench between them, each patch and marking telling a story that none of the American military personnel fully comprehended yet. Thompson photographed each insignia with careful precision, already planning to run the images through military intelligence databases that would either confirm his growing suspicions or raise even more questions. The squadron patches were the first clues. The 35th Squadron Black Spider insignia was one Thompson recognized from joint training exercises with Taiwanese forces in the 1980s. They'd flown dangerous reconnaissance missions along the mainland China coast, gathering intelligence that required nerves of steel and flying skills that pushed both pilot and aircraft to their absolute limits. Below it, a patch bearing Chinese characters that Rodriguez was photographing to send to the base translator. But it was the collection of small cloth mission markers that made Thompson's pulse quicken, each one representing a completed combat sortie into hostile territory. "These aren't ceremonial," he said, more to himself than to Margaret. "The wear patterns, the fading, these patches have been through real missions." He looked up at Margaret, seeing her perhaps for the first time despite walking past her desk every day for 3 years. "Ma'am, with all due respect, these patches indicate combat operations at a classification level that would have required extensive security clearances. I'm trying to understand how a janitor came to have them," Margaret finished quietly, her voice carrying just a trace of an accent that seemed more pronounced now that people were actually listening to her. "I understand your confusion, Sergeant. It must seem very strange." She reached for the jacket with hands that were steady now, the initial shock of discovery having given way to something that looked almost like relief. "Perhaps it is time to stop pretending to be invisible." Rodriguez knelt beside the bench, her pilot's training making her focus on technical details. "This patch here," she said, pointing to a faded insignia near the jacket's left breast. "It's from a unit that flew RF-104G starfighters. Those were reconnaissance variants. Single seat, high speed, incredibly dangerous to fly. The accident rate was..." She paused, looking at Margaret with new understanding dawning in her eyes. "You'd have to be an exceptional pilot just to survive training in one of those aircraft." The implications were staggering. The starfighter was notorious among pilots as a beautiful but unforgiving machine that demanded perfection from its operators. It wasn't an aircraft you flew as a hobby or in ceremonial roles. It was a frontline reconnaissance platform used for missions that regular pilots couldn't handle. The fact that Margaret possessed patches indicating not just familiarity with the aircraft, but successful completion of multiple combat sorties suggested a level of military service that seemed impossible to reconcile with her current role mopping floors and emptying trash cans. Thompson was already on his radio, requesting a discreet background check through military personnel databases. Ma'am, I'm not trying to cause you any trouble, but we need to verify some things. If you served with the Republic of China Air Force in a capacity that would explain these patches, there should be records, documentation. He trailed off as Margaret reached into her locker and withdrew a small, weathered folder that she'd apparently been carrying for years. Inside were documents that made everything both clearer and more mysterious. Military identification cards, flight certifications, commendation letters, all bearing Margaret's photograph from 30 years ago, when her hair was black and her face unlined by decades of carrying secrets. The woman in those photographs wore the confident expression of someone accustomed to handling multi-million-dollar aircraft and life-or-death decisions. She looked nothing like the quiet janitor they thought they knew, yet she was unmistakably the same person. Flight Lieutenant Margaret Chen, Thompson read from one of the documents, his voice filled with a respect that had been absent just hours earlier. Tactical reconnaissance pilot, 35th Squadron, Republic of China Air Force. He looked up at her, and Margaret saw recognition in his eyes, not just of her former rank, but of what that rank represented in terms of skill, courage, and sacrifice. "Ma'am," he said, and this time the title carried the weight of one military professional acknowledging another. "I think we need to have a much longer conversation." Base Commander Colonel Patricia Williams had seen many unusual situations during her 26-year Air Force career, but a decorated foreign combat pilot working as a janitor on her base was definitely a first. She sat across from Margaret in her office, the leather flight jacket now carefully displayed on the conference table between them, each patch an insignia representing a piece of military history that was reshaping everything Williams thought she knew about base security and personnel vetting. "The records check came back clean," Williams said, consulting the folder that Thompson had compiled over the past 2 hours. "Not only clean, exemplary. Flight Lieutenant Chen, you were awarded the Order of Baoyun with special distinction for reconnaissance missions that, according to these classified briefings, provided intelligence critical to regional security." She paused, studying Margaret's face for any sign of the pilot who had once flown missions so dangerous that most details remained classified even 30 years later. "The question I have to ask is why someone with your background and qualifications has been cleaning our facilities for 3 years without anyone knowing your true identity." Margaret sat with the same quiet composure she'd maintained throughout the afternoon's revelations, but now there was something different in her posture, the return of military bearing that had been carefully hidden for years. "Colonel Williams, when I immigrated to the United States in 1991, my military credentials were not recognized by your government's employment systems. The political situation between Taiwan and mainland China made my service record complicated. Bureaucratically speaking, I was a pilot without a country that officially existed in your diplomatic framework." The explanation revealed layers of complexity that Williams was only beginning to understand. The end of the Cold War had created numerous refugees and immigrants whose military service fell into bureaucratic gray areas. Margaret's situation was particularly challenging. She had served with distinction in an air force that was politically sensitive, flying missions that were classified by multiple governments holding qualifications that couldn't be easily transferred to American civilian aviation systems. "I applied for positions with commercial airlines, flight training schools, even aircraft maintenance companies," Margaret continued, her voice steady but carrying decades of accumulated frustration. "Every application required security clearances that my foreign military service complicated. Every interview ended with the same result. My experience was impressive but not verifiable through American military channels. After 2 years of rejection letters, I needed employment to support my family. Cleaning jobs don't require background checks or security clearances. They don't ask questions about your previous life." Williams felt a growing sense of institutional failure as she listened. The military prided itself on recognizing and utilizing talent, yet here was a decorated combat pilot who had been invisible to their systems for years. "Margaret? May I call you Margaret? Your flight records indicate over 800 hours of combat reconnaissance missions. You flew RF-104G starfighters in conditions that would challenge our most experienced pilots today. How did you transition from that level of responsibility to emptying your trash cans?" Margaret finished with a slight smile that held more sadness than bitterness. Colonel, you learn to find dignity in whatever work allows you to provide for your family. My daughter was 12 when we came to America. She needed school supplies, food, a stable home. Pride doesn't pay rent or buy groceries. I took the work that was available and tried to be grateful for the opportunity. The conversation was interrupted by Thompson's return with additional documentation he'd requested from military intelligence. "Ma'am," he said, addressing both women, "the classified briefings paint a remarkable picture. Flight Lieutenant Chen's reconnaissance missions provided intelligence on mainland Chinese military installations that influenced American strategic planning throughout the 1980s. Several of her flights penetrated airspace that was considered virtually impenetrable. The mission success rate for her squadron was unprecedented." Williams studied the documents with growing amazement. Margaret's service record included commendations for missions that required not just exceptional flying skills, but courage that bordered on the legendary. Night reconnaissance flights over heavily defended territory, low-level intelligence-gathering missions that pushed aircraft performance to absolute limits, emergency evacuations under combat conditions, the kind of operations that created legends within military aviation communities. "There's something else," Thompson added, his voice carrying a note of discovery that made both women look up. According to these records, Flight Lieutenant Chen was one of only 3 female pilots qualified for RF-104G combat operations in the entire Republic of China Air Force. Her call sign was Ghost Rider. Apparently she had a reputation for completing missions other pilots considered impossible, and returning from situations where aircraft were presumed lost. The revelation hung in the air like a challenge to everything they had assumed about capability, recognition, and the ways military institutions could fail their most dedicated members. Margaret Chen, the invisible janitor, was actually Ghost Rider, a pilot whose reputation had apparently transcended national boundaries and whose service record would have been remarkable in any air force, anywhere in the world. The afternoon sun slanted through Colonel Williams's office windows as Margaret began to share stories she hadn't told anyone in decades. With her true identity revealed, the careful emotional barriers she'd maintained started to crumble, revealing memories of a life lived at the intersection of courage and duty that few people could imagine. Williams had ordered coffee and cleared her schedule, recognizing that she was hearing first-hand accounts of military operations that would reshape her understanding of Cold War aviation history. "The RF-104G was not a forgiving aircraft," Margaret began, her voice taking on the technical precision of a pilot delivering a mission briefing. "Single-seat, single-engine, designed for speed rather than stability. In reconnaissance configuration, we carried cameras and electronic intelligence-gathering equipment instead of weapons, which meant if we encountered enemy aircraft, our only defense was to outrun them." She paused, her eyes focusing on something beyond the office walls. "Many pilots called it a flying coffin. We called it home." Her first combat mission had been in 1978, flying reconnaissance over mainland Chinese naval installations that intelligence agencies believed were being upgraded for offensive operations. At 26 years old, she was already considered an exceptional pilot, but nothing in training had prepared her for the reality of flying alone over hostile territory, where detection meant certain death. The mission required flying at extremely low altitude to avoid radar detection, then climbing rapidly for photography runs before diving back to terrain following altitude. The G-forces were enormous, the margin for error was 0. Williams listened with the fascination of someone hearing accounts of operations that had influenced strategic decisions at the highest levels of government. "These intelligence photographs you were gathering, they were used by American military planners?" she asked, beginning to understand how Margaret's service had contributed to broader regional security. "Joint intelligence sharing," Margaret confirmed. "Taiwan's geographic position made us invaluable for gathering information that American satellites couldn't obtain safely. My squadron provided reconnaissance that helped your military understand Chinese naval capabilities, aircraft deployments, missile installations. We were flying missions that contributed to American strategic planning throughout the Pacific region." The pride in her voice was unmistakable, not personal pride, but the satisfaction of a professional who had contributed meaningfully to causes larger than herself. Thompson had been taking notes throughout the conversation, recognizing that he was documenting military history that had never been properly recorded in American archives. "Ma'am, these missions you're describing, the risk levels sound extraordinary. How did you handle the psychological pressure of flying alone into hostile territory repeatedly?" Margaret's answer revealed the mindset that separated ordinary pilots from legends. "You focus on the mission, not the danger. Every photograph we brought back potentially saved lives. American lives, Taiwanese lives, civilian lives who would suffer if conflicts escalated due to inadequate intelligence. When you understand that your individual risk contributes to preventing larger wars, the fear becomes manageable. Not absent. Manageable." Her most dangerous mission had come in 1983, when Chinese forces had begun construction of what appeared to be advanced radar installations that could threaten both commercial and military aviation throughout the region. The reconnaissance requirement was specific: high-resolution photography of construction details that would reveal the installation's capabilities. The mission required penetrating the most heavily defended airspace in the region and maintaining level flight for photography runs while under active radar tracking. "I was detected 40 kilometers from the target," Margaret recalled, her pilot's memory retaining technical details with crystalline clarity. Surface-to-air missile sites activated, fighter aircraft scrambled from 3 different bases. The mission parameters required completing the photography runs regardless of defensive response. She paused, and Williams realized she was hearing an account of a pilot choosing mission completion over personal safety in circumstances where most people would have aborted and fled. The successful completion of that mission had provided intelligence that led to diplomatic interventions preventing what analysts believed could have escalated into regional conflict. Margaret's photographs had revealed that the installations were more advanced than previously understood, but also more vulnerable to countermeasures than expected. The intelligence had influenced American diplomatic strategy and military planning throughout the Pacific region. "After 12 years of combat operations," Margaret continued, "I had accumulated more reconnaissance flying hours than most pilots see in entire careers. But by 1989, political changes were making my position complicated. The end of the Cold War was changing everything about military cooperation and intelligence sharing. When the opportunity came to immigrate to America with my family, it seemed like a chance for a peaceful life." She smiled ruefully. "I didn't anticipate how difficult it would be to translate military service into civilian employment, especially when that service was politically sensitive." Colonel Williams spent most of that evening reviewing Margaret's service records and making phone calls to contacts in military personnel and intelligence agencies. By morning, she had assembled a picture of systemic failure that went far beyond one person's employment difficulties. Margaret Chen represented countless foreign military professionals whose service to American interests had been forgotten or overlooked by bureaucratic systems ill-equipped to recognize contributions that fell outside standard frameworks. "Margaret," Williams said when they met again the next morning, "I've spoken with General Morrison at Air Combat Command and representatives from military intelligence agencies who worked with your squadron during the 1980s. The consensus is clear. Your service contributed significantly to American strategic interests, and the failure to recognize that contribution represents a serious oversight that we need to address." The base commander had spent the night developing a plan that would serve multiple purposes: properly honoring Margaret's service, addressing the systemic issues her situation revealed, and ensuring that Peterson Air Force Base benefited from her knowledge and experience. "I'm recommending you for appointment as a civilian military advisor, specializing in reconnaissance operations and international aviation cooperation. The position would utilize your experience while providing the recognition and compensation your service deserves." Margaret sat quietly for a moment, processing the magnitude of the change being offered. After 3 years of invisibility, the prospect of professional recognition was overwhelming. "Colonel, I appreciate the gesture, but I'm not certain I'm ready to return to that world. I've spent decades learning to live quietly." "With respect," Williams replied, "the military world never left you. You've been carrying it with you every day, in every hallway you've cleaned, in every office you've maintained. The difference is that now we know about it, and we can benefit from it properly." She leaned forward, her expression conveying the sincerity of someone making a professional judgment based on capability rather than sentiment. "Margaret, we have young pilots training for reconnaissance missions who could learn from your experience. We have international cooperation programs that could benefit from your insights. We have intelligence analysis requirements that would be enhanced by your operational perspective." The formal recognition ceremony took place 2 weeks later in Peterson's main auditorium, with base personnel who had walked past Margaret for 3 years now, understanding exactly who had been among them all along. General Morrison had flown in from Colorado Springs, bringing with him declassified documents that revealed the full scope of Margaret's contributions to American intelligence operations during the Cold War. "Ladies and gentlemen," Williams addressed the assembled crowd, "today we correct a long overdue oversight. Flight Lieutenant Margaret Chen served with distinction in operations that contributed directly to American security interests throughout the Pacific region. Her reconnaissance missions provided intelligence that influenced strategic planning at the highest levels of government. Today we welcome her not as someone we're just discovering, but as someone we're finally recognizing properly." The presentation of a civilian service medal was accompanied by reading of citations that revealed mission details declassified specifically for the ceremony. Young airmen listened in amazement as they learned that the quiet woman who had cleaned their ready room had flown missions more dangerous than anything they were likely to encounter. Veteran officers who had served during the Cold War recognized the significance of operations they had only heard about in classified briefings. But the most meaningful moment came when Staff Sergeant Rodriguez approached Margaret after the ceremony. "Ma'am," she said, using the tone of respect between military professionals, "I wanted to apologize for not seeing you before. And I wanted to ask if you'd be willing to share some of your experience with our reconnaissance training program. We could learn a lot from someone who actually flew those missions." Margaret's response captured the essence of what the recognition meant to her. "Sergeant, I've been waiting 30 years for someone to ask that question. I'd be honored to help train the next generation of pilots, especially if it means they'll be better prepared for whatever challenges they face." As the ceremony concluded, and base personnel approached Margaret with questions about her experience, Colonel Williams reflected on the broader lesson the situation provided. Military institutions were only as strong as their ability to recognize and utilize talent, regardless of where that talent originated or how it arrived. Margaret Chen's story was ultimately about more than one person's recognition. It was about the invisible contributors whose service often goes unacknowledged until someone takes the time to look beyond surface appearances. The leather flight jacket now hangs in Peterson Air Force Base's Heritage Hall, each patch and insignia properly documented and explained to visitors who want to understand the complex history of international military cooperation. But more importantly, Margaret Chen now works daily with young pilots, sharing hard-earned wisdom about reconnaissance operations, international aviation, and the kind of courage that transforms ordinary individuals into legends. Margaret Chen's story reminds us that heroes don't always announce themselves with fanfare and ceremony. Sometimes they work quietly among us, carrying their extraordinary experiences with humble dignity, while contributing in ways we never recognize until circumstance reveals their true nature. For 3 years, Peterson Air Force Base was home to a decorated combat pilot whose reconnaissance missions had influenced American strategic planning, whose courage had contributed to regional stability, and whose expertise could have enhanced training programs from the moment she arrived. The failure to recognize Margaret's capabilities earlier wasn't malicious. It was systemic, the result of bureaucratic processes ill-equipped to identify talent that arrived through unconventional channels. But her story also demonstrates the military's capacity for correction when leadership chooses to look beyond assumptions and protocol to focus on capability and character. Today, young pilots training at Peterson benefit from instruction by someone who has actually flown the missions they're preparing for. Intelligence analysts learn from someone who gathered information under combat conditions, and everyone on base understands that extraordinary service can hide behind the most ordinary appearances, waiting for recognition that honors both the individual and the institution they serve. Margaret's journey from ghostwriter to invisible janitor to recognized military advisor proves that it's never too late to see people for who they really are and that the most valuable members of any organization might be the ones we walk past every day without truly noticing. Thank you for watching this story of courage, recognition, and the heroes who serve quietly among us. If Margaret's journey inspired you, please subscribe for more stories that honor the extraordinary individuals who dedicate their lives to service, sacrifice, and protecting the freedoms we hold dear. These stories matter. These heroes matter. And their legacy lives on through our willingness to see, recognize, and honor their contributions.